everyone. So today's slip lecture is sort of an introduction to ecology and some ecological interactions among species. First of all, when we think of ecology, we often think of just the living organisms within an environment. But actually, ecology encompasses not just relationships of organisms to one another, but also relationships between those organisms and their physical surroundings. Within ecology, there's sort of a hierarchy of the way you talk about these relationships between organisms and then the relationships between organisms and their physical surroundings. And that hierarchy has these various levels of how you discuss this. So in this first level, we talk about ecology at the organism level. So a single organism of a single species. So you can talk about how the single organism of a single species is acting within the environment. The next level of ecology is at the population level. So this population level, you have multiple individuals of the same species living in the same space. Right? So we start off with one organism, one individual of one species, and then if you get many of those organisms of the same species living in the same space. And this same space is an important addition to just the species, because you can have two different populations of the same species. For example, you can have a population of coyotes that lives on the west coast, and then you can have a population of coyotes that lives on the east coast. Those are separate populations because they are living in different places, and the individuals in those different populations are not interacting in any way. So the next level of hierarchy is when you have different populations of different species existing in the same space. So a community is where you're getting groups of different species living together in the same area. And at this time, all of the relationships so far are talking about living organisms and their interactions together. When you start talking about how these communities are interacting with their physical environment, then you get an ecosystem. And then if you talk about all of the ecosystems that exist on our planet, you're discussing the biosphere. So if you look at this picture, so my question here is, does this picture depict one or many ecosystems? Give you a second to think about that. You can pause the video. So this picture actually depicts many different ecosystems. You can have a separate ecosystem within the river itself. You have an ecosystem sort of happening within the meadows. You have the forest ecosystem. You have the ecosystems that exist in the mountains. So many, many different ecosystems in this picture. And this is actually referred to as a landscape. Right? So an area that you can see but actually has these ecosystems within this greater area. And even within each ecosystem, like the meadow ecosystem, you can have sort of micro ecosystems like what's going on in the soil community. Now within this landscape, you have these different ecosystems, but each ecosystem doesn't necessarily stop abruptly and go right into another ecosystem. You sort of have these transition zones between different ecosystems. And those transition zones are called ecotones. So again, these ecotones are transition zones between ecosystems. And what's kind of neat about these ecotones is that in some cases you have species that only exist, are unique to the ecotone itself. And then you have other species that can kind of migrate through one ecosystem and then the ecotone and the other ecosystem. So some species exist just in the ecotones, some species exist just in the individual ecosystems, and some species kind of travel through multiple areas. When we look at ecosystems, there's something that we can do to ecosystems that has an interesting effect called edge effect. So oftentimes we like to sort of bisect an ecosystem. So you can see here in Yellowstone National Park, it has this road right here that goes all the way through the park, and it essentially splits the park into two. And that might not seem like much, but there are some species that really need to be in an interior habitat, sort of away from any human interference. And those would be your interior species, like in this dark green area. There are then other species that can tolerate living on the edges. So living on the edges, closer to human habitation, closer to the edge of the ecosystem, closer to the road. Right? So you have your edge species. So when you bisect that ecosystem, you're essentially going to be creating, in the second picture on the right, you're going to be creating more edge habitat, and then you are decreasing the interior habitat. So whenever a habitat gets fragmented, you get an increase in edge habitat and an increase in edge species, and then you get a decrease in this interior habitat and interior species, so that the edge species could eventually outcompete those interior species. When we talk about environmental factors within an ecosystem, there's a couple different types of factors that you need to be aware of. There are biotic factors, which are living factors, so living things. These would be like plants, animals, bacteria, bugs, etc. And then you have abiotic factors, which are non-living. So this could be like the water, it could be the temperature, it could be how much precipitation it gets, the wind. Any of those could be abiotic, non-living factors that are influencing the ecosystem. You can also have conditions, and then you can have resources. So resources are going to be consumed, and then conditions are sort of like what the ecosystem is existing in. And the conditions and resources are often separate. Water can be both a condition and a resource, right? Because water, you can exist within the water, but then it can also be a resource that is being consumed by organisms. So when we look at where organisms exist within an ecosystem, it often has to do with their tolerance of various conditions or amounts of resource, right? And within this tolerance, you have a range of resource or condition. So if we just look at temperature, like in this graph, you can have low temperatures and then you can have high temperatures. So you have this range of temperature from low to high. And if you're an organism, you're really going to want to be in a particular range. So if you even think about us, if you had to exist in a climate without the use of like fancy puffies or air conditioning, your ideal range of temperature tolerance would probably be around like 70 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So that's going to be your optimum range. So we can go like 65 to 75 is where you're really going to want to exist. It's where you're going to thrive the best, right? So optimum range, where organisms thrive the best, and that's going to differ depending on the type of organism. So therefore, you're going to find the highest abundance, right? So the top of this curve at that optimum range. Now, if you think about as it starts to heat up, right? Again, no air conditioning, no fancy cooling devices, right? If we get upwards of like 80 degrees Fahrenheit, if we had to exist there for a while, we're going to be a little bit stressed out. We're going to start sweating. We're going to be uncomfortable, right? Or if we had to go below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, we're going to start shivering. We're going to get kind of cold if we don't have our nice puffies, right? So those ranges of temperature, below 60, above 80, right, we're going to be stressed. We can exist there, right, for a while, or maybe even indefinitely, but we're not going to like it. We're going to be kind of stressed out, right? So since that's not the optimal temperature for us, we don't really like being there, there's going to be fewer organisms that are going to choose to live in that zone. Now, if you get even higher or lower, right, so say we get up to like 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or we get below like 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and we have to exist there again. No cooling, no fancy puffies, right? We can't really exist at that temperature with absolutely no help, I guess, for very long, right? So that's going to be our zone of intolerance, and you're not going to find any organisms in the zone of intolerance because they're just not going to be able to survive and thrive in that temperature zone or in that resource condition zone. All right, so you find the most organisms in this optimum range, and then it sort of tapers off as you get into the zone of stress, because it's not ideal, and then you're going to be bottoming out in this zone of intolerance. So that zone of tolerance can also help determine what an organism's habitat is going to be. And a habitat is where an organism lives. So it's home. So your habitat at Holderness is your dorm room, right? That's where you're spending most of your time, where you're really living. Habitat is not the same thing as niche. So we're going to go over niche a little bit later. A habitat can be a part of an organism's niche, but the two of them are not the same thing. So habitat is just where an organism lives. So then once you've kind of figured out where organisms are existing with this tolerance in conditions and resources, and then that's deciding where their habitat is, you're going to start having some overlap, right? So you're going to start seeing some interactions between different species. And these interactions can have positive, negative, or zero effect on the individual species. So we're going to talk a little bit and do an activity around these different interactions. So one type of interaction between species is a predator-prey interaction, right? Predator-prey interaction is where the predator is eating the prey. So obviously for the predator, that's going to be a positive thing. For the prey, not so great because it gets eaten, right? Parasitism is similar to this, except that the prey is not consumed. It's not necessarily killed, right? If you have one parasite, the prey organism or the host organism is not necessarily always killed by that one parasite, right? If it's like many, many, many parasites, then that's different, right? So if you think of like ticks, right? You get one tick on you, it's going to harm you. So again, it's this negative effect, right? But might not necessarily kill you, so different from predation. And then parasitism, if you're the tick, you get the blood from the host, so obviously a good thing for you. We are going to talk about competition later on. Competition is sort of this special circumstance, this special interaction which requires a little bit more digging into, because competition is actually going to be a negative effect on both species. So species actually try to avoid competition directly because no one really wins completely. When you look at mutualism, right? Mutualism, they're mutually beneficial, right? So in a mutualistic relationship, both species have this plus. Both species are going to be benefiting, right? Sort of the classic example of this is bees pollinating flowers, right? So the bee gets the nectar from the flowers, uses it to make honey, and then the flower is able to spread its pollen to other flowers and therefore reproduce. Commensalism is kind of a neat thing. This is where one species benefits and the other just doesn't really care that much, right? So one species is benefiting from the interaction, the other species is like, I don't really care that you're there. Right, and you guys will look at some examples of those tomorrow. Amensalism is a weird one, and there's not a whole lot of examples of amensalism. So amensalism is where one species gets harmed, but that harm is not benefiting the other species. So I like to think of this as like accidental harm, right? So one species is sort of accidentally, like not totally on purpose, harming the other species. So look out for a couple of examples of that tomorrow. So the types of interactions that you're going to be looking at in this activity are going to be parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, and amensalism. We are going to be doing predator-prey interactions and competition sort of individually later on. So we're going to put those on the back burner for now, and we're just talking about these four: parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, amensalism. And if you can kind of organize those in your thoughts as these plus, minuses, zeros, that can be really helpful. All right, and that is it. I will see y'all later.